Intellectual anarchy is full of lights. Its blindness is made up of dazzling survivals, revivals, and fresh beginnings. Were it not for these remnants or seeds of the other, chaos itself could not exist. It would be nothing. Without demanding from the men of today anything final or solid, we may be grateful to them for those glimpses of great things past and great things possible, which flash through their laboring minds. One of these great things past is Platonism, and one of the great things always possible is spiritual life. There is, or there seems to be, a certain affinity between these two, as if deep called unto deep. Yet I am not sure that everything in Platonism or even its first principles can be called spiritual, nor is it easy to discern what the essence of spirituality may be, entangled as its manifestations have always been with all sorts of accidental traditions and prejudices. In this perplexity, I find a list of points common to Platonism and to spiritual religion, drawn up by the competent hand of the Dean of St. Paul's. These points are a firm belief in absolute and eternal values as the most real things in the universe, a confidence that these values are knowable by man, a belief that they can nevertheless be known only by wholehearted consecration of the intellect, will, and affections to the great quest, an entirely open mind towards the discoveries of science, a reverent and receptive attitude to the beauty, sublimity, and wisdom of the creation as a revelation of the mind and character of the Creator, a complete indifference to the current valuations of the worldling. This faith is distinguished among other things by its deep love of this good and beautiful world, combined with a steady rejection of that same world whenever it threatens to conceal instead of revealing the unseen and eternal world behind. The Platonist loves nature because in nature he perceives spirit creating after its own likeness. As soon as the seen and the unseen worlds fall apart and lose connection with each other, both are dead. Values are, for the Platonists, not only ideals, but creative powers. This, of course, is the language of a modern. Dean Inge is not quoting Plato or Plotinus, but expressing what he believes to be substantially their view in words natural to a man of his own country and religion. We must therefore puzzle a little and hazard a guess before we can recall the Platonic tenets to which some of these phrases may refer. The term value, in particular, is subjective, imageless, and in a manner evasive. It may be taken as a neutral term, fairly representing the common quality of what Plato called the good and the beautiful, before these were hypostatized. But then to hypostatize not only such values, but all natural types and logical concepts was the very soul of Platonism. And when the good and the beautiful have been hypostatized and have become God or the One, the ideas, the demiurgus, or the soul of the world, they are no longer values but independent beings existing long before the need or the admiration of mortals could attribute any value to them. Value is something relative, a dignity which anything may acquire in the view of the benefit or satisfaction which it brings to some living being. If God or the ideas were mere values, as are pleasure or health, they would be unsubstantial and only a desired or achieved perfection in something else. They might indeed have value in their own eyes, but only if they were alive. A man or a god cannot prize his existence before he exists, and automatic harmony must be established in his life before he can distinguish its direction, suffer at its diminution, or conceive and desire its greater perfection. This harmony itself is a good only because the spirit which it creates so regards it. If I were a theologian or even a bishop, I might be innocently led to ask Dean Inge what he means by a value. Is it anything that anybody values, or only that which some other person thinks we ought to value? Is it the fact that some satisfying aspect is found in things, or rather a magic necessity providing that such an aspect shall be found there? Or, as we gather from other Cambridge philosophers, is this necessity not magical, but natural and omnipresent in things, so that whenever a wave rises and bursts into foam, or a snowflake takes shape in the air, or any other form trembles for a moment in the flux of existence, the realization of this visiting essence is intrinsically of value, whether it be watched and prized by any spirit or not. Or, on the contrary, are values existing supernatural beings, by their influence compelling or inclining nature often to reproduce these satisfactory aspects? And I might even like to ask, going a little deeper, whether such supernatural beings, granted that they exist, work in nature towards the production of values of any and every sort, as the law of the survival of the fittest might work to produce harmony between each sort of animal and its habitat, but to make their forms and their pleasures more and more diverse, or whether these supernatural beings are biased in favor of certain natural forms and certain values to the exclusion of others, and finally, whether it is this congenital bias in supernatural powers that we should understand by the eternal reality of values. In the modern notion, a very hazy one, that values themselves might be forces, there is a contradiction, or at least an ellipsis, in any single instance. Indeed, a mind disinclined to look for the causes or origins of things may find in actual value a final and satisfying fact. Felt values reconcile the animal and moral side of our nature to their own contingency. If anything is well, we neglect to ask why it happens. The inner connivance and peace of our will explain it sufficiently. But when values are supposed to sustain themselves in being through a long tangle of circumstances, and to reassert themselves intermittently by their own strength, we are not merely content not to inquire why they arise, but we profess to explain their occasions and causes by their future presence. Position not only impossible to defend, but impossible to conceive clearly, and one that can be held only under cover of half thoughts and cant phrases. Perception carves out its conventional units, and final causes insinuate themselves into the survey of facts, when their patient genius is ignored or untraceable. Life on the whole is a proof of the possibility of life. Each sort of life is a proof that circumstances made that sort of life inevitable. A vigorous and courageous animal assumes that fortune will not fail him. Did he not assume it? How should he be able to live? This sense of safety may be expressed and justified intellectually by finding the facts or habits of nature which support our own habits, and so bring the customary values about in the round of our experience. If these favoring circumstances are dominant in our world, we shall be as safe in fact as we feel ourselves to be by instinct. This situation might then be expressed elliptically by saying that the good is certain to prevail, or that values are powers, the justification for such an expression being that our assurance of safety and good fortune rests on a substantial harmony between our interests and our circumstances. But when this harmony becomes audible, when for a moment some value is realized, all potentiality and material efficacy are left far behind. We are in the realm of actuality, of music, of spirit, and the value actualized lives and ends in itself. The promise which often lies in it, as well as the disillusion or disaster that may ensue, will not be due to that value in its moral nature, to that living and immaterial good. It will be due to the organization of nature beneath. All moral functions have their material organs and their material effects. In that context, they are powers, or rather vehicles of power, for as the Muslims say, there is no power but Allah. Goods are, in their usual ground, an integral part of the flux of events, and the healthy habit in nature which creates them once may repeat them and perfect them, if the season is favorable and the fates allow. For my purpose, however, it is fortunately unimportant to dispel these ambiguities, dear to half-hearted philosophies, because the Platonic doctrine, at least, is clear. If, for the Platonist, goods and evils are everlastingly fixed and distinct, this moral dogmatism in him is no accident of temperament, no mere lack of moral elasticity, as in the bigot. If he is sure that some goods, often passionately loved, are nevertheless false goods, it is only because he attributes a definite and unchangeable constitution to the material world and to human nature. Life, he thinks, has been kindled and is alone sustained by the influence of pre-existing celestial models. It is by imitating these models in some measure that we exist at all, and only in imitating, loving, and contemplating them that we can ever be happy. They are our good. In themselves, however, they are inviolate beings, serenely shedding, like the stars, an everlasting radiance, and no doubt happy beings, if they are living and self-contemplative. But they are by no means mere goals which this nether world sets freely for itself, or perfections which it might enjoy intrinsically. God and the ideas could be ruling powers because they were existing beings, definite in their character and influence. They exercised a miraculous magnetic control over formless matter, inducing in it here and there an inward striving to imitate their forms. They therefore had the greatest value, for the creature whose life was directed upon them and who invincibly loved them. But this value in them remained relative to the aspiration of their lover, and variable insofar as his nature might change, so that St. Thomas Aquinas goes so far as to say that the sinner God becomes an evil, the Christian God, he means. For I suppose the reprobate might find a divine friend in Bacchus or Venus. It was never the actual values found in the world that were separated from it, either in Platonism or in Christianity, and conceived to compose an eternal world behind it. The powers that were creative, substantial, and permanent were not values at all, but the underpinning which values required if they were to arise. And although this substructure had to be in itself physical or metaphysical, the discovery of it had momentous consequences for morals, in that it enabled the enlightened believer to distinguish possible attainable goods from the impossible happiness after which the heathen seek. Those goods, which the nature of things or the will of God assures and sanctions, are the eternal values. The others are the current valuations of the worldling. Thus, religion or philosophy was the great arbiter of true values, the guide of life. It justified the sense of sin and the hope of salvation. The distinction between true goods and false goods can never be established by ignorant feeling or by conscience not backed by a dogmatic view of the facts. For felt values, taken absolutely and regarded as unconditioned, are all equally genuine in their excellence, and equally momentary in their existence. The distinction hangs on the system of forces, natural or supernatural, believed to produce and sustain these various goods, some for a moment, others forever. Some constitution the cosmos must have and must disclose to our faith or science, if ever we are to decide which of our pleasures or affectations reveal the unseen and eternal world behind it, and which of them threaten to conceal it. This separation of the Platonic ideas from the things which manifested them has been much blamed, yet it goes with another doctrine which is much prized, often by the same critics. The precious consequence of this abhorred dualism was that the ideas, if separate, might be powers, creative forces that generated their expressions. Separation is a prerequisite to causal connection. A thing cannot be derived from a part of itself. If ideas were only values, if they were immanent in things, as the form of a poem or its peculiar beauty is immanent in that poem, there would be no sense in saying that the beauty or the form was a power that had produced the poem. Not only would each be dead without the other, as Dean Inge says, but each would be nothing. The poem arises by taking that form, and the form is merely that precise arrangement of words and images. The beauty of a thing is an essence which it manifests spontaneously, a pure quality of being revealed there, and perhaps never to be revealed again. The natural causes that produce the thing and bring it to notice produce also this manifestation of beauty in it. Both spring into existence together out of a complex of circumstances and impulses, among which it is impossible to place that homeless essence, the form of beauty thereby revealed. Yet this form is their only value for the spirit, a value which that precise conjunction of causes was needed to realize. There is a sense, a somewhat esoteric sense, in which such essences as beauty may be called the most real things in the universe. They are the ultimate characters by which one thing can be distinguished from another in the flux of nature, or one thought from another in the mind. And if the word real be used sentimentally to mean whatever is most clear or important or nearest to the heart, such values will be not only most real, but even the only reality, because their presence or absence, their purity or contradiction, make up the spiritual sum of life, all that matters in it, without which no one would care to raise his head from the pillow of non-being. If, however, by most real we understand most primitive or fundamental physicality, the roots of existence, it is clearly impossible that the most real things should be values. Values presuppose living beings having a direction of development and exerting themselves in it, so that good and evil may exist in reference to them, that the good should be relative to actual natures and simply their innate ideal, latent or realized, is essential to its being truly a good. Otherwise, the term good would be an empty title applied to some existing object or force for no assignable reason. The good may, nevertheless, be called absolute in several senses proper to current speech. The good is by no means relative to opinion, but is rooted in the unconscious and fatal nature of living beings, a nature which predetermines for them the difference between foods and poisons, happiness and misery. The moralist may speak for others with authority when he knows them better than they know themselves, but not otherwise. Moreover, their natural good may be absolute in the sense of being fixed and unalterable, so long as the living beings concerned and the circumstances in which they flourish remain constant in type. That human nature and the world are unchangeable was an assumption of classic times which survives often in modern moralists without its dogmatic justification. Finally, the good may be called absolute in the sense of being single and all-sufficient, filling the whole heart and leaving nothing in the rest of the universe in the least tempting, interesting, or worth distinguishing. It is in this sense that lovers and mystics proclaim the absoluteness of the good with which they are united, and when the thing is true as a confession, it would be frivolous and ungracious to quarrel with it as a dogma. If then the ideas were eminent in things, as the beauty of a poem is eminent in it, they could not conceivably be powers producing their occasional manifestation. The beauties intrinsic to the tragedy of Hamlet could not have caused Shakespeare to compose that play, since those values could not possibly come to existence until the play had already composed itself in his fancy and burst into just those beauties. In order to maintain seriously the efficacy of ideas and to conceive matters in the orthodox Platonic way, we must make a different supposition. Suppose Hamlet had been a living prince, like the present Prince of Wales, and that Shakespeare with his company of players, had happened to appear at this prince's court, and had conceived for him a passionate Platonic attachment, such as he seems to have conceived for the W.H. of the sonnets, and suppose further that, by the prodigious inspiration of this passion, Shakespeare had been led to imagine episodes and phrases that might in part express so tender, intellectual, and profound a character as that living prince seemed to him to possess. Then, indeed, most real Hamlet, with a pre-existing power and charm, might have been the only begetter of the play. In exactly this way, the Platonic ideas, the Christian God, or the Christ of devout Christians, may be conceived to be the causes of their temporal manifestations in matter or in the souls of men. Evidently, a play written in such circumstances might have the same intrinsic value as one purely imaginary, but it would not be this literary value that would constitute the model or the creative influence which had produced the play. This literary value would have been begotten, like the play itself, and inseparably from it, by the influence radiating from the living Hamlet, a prince having his existence apart, who by chance had come for a moment within the poet's orbit. This separation between the creator and the created is not only the condition of derivation, contact, and causal influence, but it is also the condition of a genuine worship, because then that which is expression in the poet is at the same time homage in the lover, as it could not be except fatuously and by a poetic affectation if the being loved did not exist separately. And only begetter is the right phrase to indicate the relation between such a creative influence and its work. A Platonic idea could never be the whole cause of its temporal expressions. A material or feminine element is involved that may receive that influence and make it fruitful, a fact which would also explain the many variants and the many imperfections which things might exhibit in response to the same unchanging virtue of their divine model. When the matter is so conceived, all force departs from the contention that if we separate God or the ideas from the temporal world, both are dead. God and the ideas, like the living Prince Hamlet, would remain exactly as they were, with all their intrinsic warmth and virtue, and the temporal world, like the Shakespearean tragedy, would also remain just as it is, with all of its literary values. The only difference would be that the living prince would have inspired no poet, and that the self-inspired poet would have celebrated no living prince. Shakespeare's Hamlet would be reduced to what, in fact, he is, an object of occasional imagination, a pure essence, and not a power. Meantime, the inexhaustible powers which, if a divine life existed, would certainly lie in it, would have continued to radiate unmanifested, like those many rays of the sun which are dissipated in space, not being, by chance, reflected or absorbed and made temporarily fruitful by any speck of an earth. Platonism, accordingly, would be entirely stultified and eviscerated if it were not suffered to be all that modern criticism, inspired as it is by a subjective and psychological philosophy, most thoroughly dislikes. I mean, supernaturalistic, realistic, and dualistic. This is only another way of saying that, according to the Platonic doctrine, God and the unseen world really exist in themselves so that they can precede, create, attract, and survive their earthly emanations. Is this to say that Aristotle and all other critics of Platonism have had no reason on their side? Far from it. Their criticism was amply justified by the facts of nature, and their only defect was perhaps not to have felt its full force, and to have still attributed power to those very ideas to which they denied separate existence. The Platonic system is mythological. If taken literally and dogmatically, it can seem to cold reason nothing but a gratuitous fiction, as all systems of religion or metaphysics necessarily seem to the outsider. Of course, they are not inwardly gratuitous. They are the fervent expression and product of the deepest minds, and anyone capable of sharing the inspiration which prompted them will know them to be inevitable, persuasive, and morally coherent. Thus, Dean Inge says that those who think Platonism dualistic have simply not understood. That is, if I myself understand him, that they have not understood it from within, genetically, historically, emotionally. They have not recovered the experience and the immanent logic which, as a matter of fact, held the Platonic dualism in solution. This dualism appears only in the dogma precipitated and left, as it were, as a sediment, and the most sympathetic modern critic can hardly take such dogma seriously. He cannot receive it as a revelation, like a humble catechumen drinking in the marvelous supernatural facts from the lips of the masters. Platonism, like Christianity, cannot now produce in him the illusion which it was its early mission to produce. When he turns back to the origin of such a faith, he cannot, for all his sympathy, share the prophetic impulse which carried the fathers from their first intuitions to the full expression of the same in consistent and final dogmas. Truth for him means historical, psychological truth, and the whole course of his learning and imagination is spent in dissolving those dogmas dramatically into their subjective components and showing them to be but verbal expressions for certain radical ambient values. This is what, in fact, they were, or something of that kind, and he may be assured of this not merely by the naturalistic philosophy, perhaps unconsciously inspiring him, which proclaimed such dogmas to be nothing else, but by the study of the surviving documents. Plato's writings, in particular, show clearly that the eventual Platonic system was but a moral and poetic fable. The ideas originally were really nothing but values. Socrates had conceived them as forms of the good, and this good itself was identical with the useful, beneficent, or advantageous. In the Republic, we learn that anything, a shepherd or a ruler, a bridle or a bed, is good when it fulfills its natural function. Fitness to control a horse for the purposes of war, commerce, or sport would be the idea or value of a bridle, and fitness to induce sound and comfortable sleep would be, I suppose, the idea of a bed. And as to the eternal idea of a ruler or shepherd, What should it be but to protect and conduct his sheep or his people, and in due season to shear them? This homely Socratic wisdom may seem not far removed from the current valuations of the worldling. It rested on no revelation, private or public, and had no principle save the reasonableness of the simplest mortal when forced by shrewd questions to disentangle his prejudices and to discover what he really wants. But great is the power of logic when the mind is single and the heart open. In a trice, it will bring the humblest judgments into the clarifying presence of the highest good. Socrates was a plain man, but fearless. He was omnivorous, playful, ironical, but absolutely determined. His one purpose was to be rational, to find and do what was best. If Anaxagoras would tell him what profit men might draw from the sun and moon, he would listen gladly. But if it was only a question of the substance or motions of those bodies, he would turn his back on Anaxagoras and laugh. This cobbler's wisdom was the same that almost made saints of the cynics. It reappeared in the monks. It may reappear any day in some popular prophet. A fervid utilitarianism has a strangely revolutionary force. In squeezing the world to get every drop of pure good out of it, it leaves the world worthless and has to throw it away. Nothing remains but the immediate good of the spirit, the naked soul longing to be saved. In Plato and in his followers, this revolution took more time and a larger sweep. Plato's mind was more accomplished and less consecrated than that of his master. That of his followers was more dogmatic and single than his own. Idealism, as it moves away from its origins, may easily become idolatrous. While leaving earthly things dry and empty, it may worship the pure forms which these things would have had if they had been perfect. In criticizing and condemning this world, the prophet will find himself in the presence of another world, its sublimated image. The gift of thinking in myths, once native to the Greeks, was not altogether lost. It could still fuse the forms seen with a life unseen. It could transform definition of terms into intuition of ideas. It could personify the functions of things and turn their virtues into patron deities, animating those things and causing them to shine with a strength and beauty alien to their earthly substance. In the unclouded, synthetic, believing mind of Plotinus, this chastened mythology crystallized into the most beautiful of systems. An inexhaustible divine energy, so the system ran, poured perpetually down into the chaos of matter, animating and shaping it as well as that torpid substance would permit. At the bottom or center, there was little life, but it stirred more actively and nobly at each successive level, somewhat as the light of the sun floods the ether absolutely, the air variously, the sea dubiously, and the earth only darkly, with a shallow warmth. Hence, the hierarchy of created goods, which is itself a good, and as to the defeats and confusions involved in being other than the highest and other than one's own idea, they were due to the inopportune inertia of matter, or to blind accident, or to a diabolical soul intervening and poisoning the fountains of divine grace. All levels of being were good in some measure, each after its kind, consistently, and yet perhaps only with an effort and against the spirit of his times. Plotinus defended the excellence of the material world against the Gnostics, and the worthiness of the state and of the traditions of Hellenism, so that an emperor and even an empress might be his auditors without offense, and his philosophy remained Socratic in principle, a mythical underpinning to morals, and not a view of nature founded on observation, like those of the Stoics and the Epicureans. Yet in the 500 or 600 years since Socrates, moral life itself had changed its center. The good of the soul and her salvation had taken the place of domestic, military, and political goods, so that while the various spheres of being, like the terraces of Dante's Purgatorio, were all permanent and divinely appointed, the Spirit now moved through them without rest. Its abiding place was beyond. They were but the rounds of a Jacob's ladder by which the soul might climb again to her native heaven, and it was only there, above, that she truly lived and had been blessed from all eternity. Platonism, as Dean Inge observes, has no tendency to become pantheistic. Its first principle is the difference between good and evil. Its final dogmas describe a half astronomical, half dramatic setting for the phases of spiritual life. The divine spirit burned with such an intense and concentrated fire. It was so rich in its inner being, it overflowed into a celestial hierarchy of so many choirs, all superior to man. Even on earth it found so many marvelous and amiable non-human manifestations that man, with his two-footed featherlessness and his political artifices, lost his ancient Hellenic dignity. It was almost a disgrace for the soul to be expressed in a body, or a body in a statue. Thus, the imagined universe, which was to shelter morality, threatened to outgrow its original office. Man and his earthly fortunes began to seem to the contemplative mind but incidents in the barnyard. The only ambition worthy of a philosopher was to transcend and transfigure his human nature, and to pass unsullied through this nether world in adoration of the world above. Plotinus professed to be, and actually was, an orthodox Platonist, and yet this dominant sense in him of the spiritual life was perfectly foreign to Socrates and Plato. I say this without forgetting the dialogues on love or the almost Roman religiosity of the laws. After having been very poetical, Plato became very austere, but his philosophy remained political to the end. To this descendant of Solon, the universe could never be anything but a crystal case to hold the jewel of a Greek city. Divine as the heavens were, they were but a mothering and brooding power. In their refined materiality and mathematical divinity, they circled about the earth, at once vivifying it and rebuking it by the visible presence of an exemplary good. The notion of the heavenly spheres was no mere optical image. The dream of a philosopher who, on a clear night, can measure the radius of the universe with the naked eye. This image was a moral parable. The realm of ethics will always be a set of concentric circles. Life necessarily radiates from centers. It stirs here in the self. From here it looks abroad for supports and extensions in the family, the nation, the intellectual world, the parent and subject universe. Wide as it may seem, this prospect is homely and taken from the hearth of Vesta. If the theology of Socrates and Plato was in this way domestic, the remnant of traditional religion in them was doubly so. Their attachment to ancient piety was childlike and superstitious when it remained personal, but more often it was expressly political and politic. They saw in religion a ready means of silencing dangerous questions and rebuking wickedness. It was a matter of moral education and police, and in no sense spiritual. As to the Socratic philosophy of love, there is an obvious spiritual tendency in it, inasmuch as it bids the heart turn from the temporal to the eternal, and it does so not by way of an arid logic, but by a true discipline of the affections, sublimating erotic passion into a perfect enthusiasm for all things beautiful and perfect. This is the secret of Platonism, which makes it perennial, so that if it were ever lost as a tradition, it would presently be revived as an inspiration. It lives by a poignant sense of eternal values, the beautiful and the good, revealed for a moment in living creatures or in earthly harmonies. Yet who has not felt that this Platonic enthusiasm is somewhat equivocal and vain? Why? Because its renunciation is not radical in surrendering some particular hope or some personal object of passion. It preserves and feeds the passion itself. There is no true catharsis, no liberation, but a sort of substitution and subterfuge, often hypocritical. Pure spiritual life cannot be something compensatory, a consolation for having missed more solid satisfactions. It should be rather the flower of all satisfactions, in which satisfaction becomes free from care, selfless, wholly actual, and, in that inward sense, eternal. Spiritual life is simple and direct, but it is intellectual. Love, on the contrary, as Plotinus says, is something material based on craving and a sense of want. For this reason, the beautiful and the good for the Platonic enthusiast remain urgent values. He would cease to be a true Platonist or a rapt lover if he understood, if he discounted his illusions, rose above the animal need or the mental prejudice which made those values urgent and relegated them to their relative station whereby their nature they belong. Yet this is what a pure spirit would do, one truly emancipated and enlightened.